period of violence and economic disruption between 1200 and 1000 BC destroyed the Mycenaean civilization and severely weakened other societies across the Mediterranean world. Most of these societies recovered within 100 years and were back on their feet by 900 BC, but for the Greeks, an extra 150 years would be needed to end their dark age in 750 BC. Like the Minoans, the Mycenaeans operated on a redistributive economy, so when the Mycenaean palace systems collapsed, life for most people became much more difficult. Due to the economic collapse, there was no longer a need to keep accounting records, and the Greeks lost almost all their knowledge of writing during this period, resorting to oral storytelling instead. With no more palace rulers to protect the countryside from raiders, farming was largely abandoned as well. Many Greeks during this time turned to animal herding to provide for their families. The nomadic lifestyle that resulted from this change in occupation, along with the various other recent calamities, led to a general poverty among the Greeks. That is not to say that the collapse of Mycenaean civilization was a great equalizer between the rich and the poor, though. Archaeological excavations at tombs in Lefkandi and Nicoria show that a wealth gap persisted, and although there were fewer of them, elite members of society still existed during the Dark Age. In the early part of the Dark Age, most Greeks could not afford to bury their dead with anything other than a few clay pots, but by 900 BC, a small margin of people began to build up enough wealth to bury their loved ones with metal weapons and other valuables. Two burial sites from Athens during this period can clue us into how the Greeks began pulling themselves out of their Dark Age with the forging of iron. The techniques needed to forge iron, which replaced bronze as the metal of choice, was probably learned from foreign traders who were still traveling to Greece in search of metal ores. The first burial site at Athens dates to about 900 BC and contains the remains of a man surrounded by iron weapons, keeping with Mycenaean tradition. The second burial site, dated to 850 BC, contains the remains of a wealthy woman who, in addition to gold jewelry, was buried with pots representative of granaries. The fact that these granary models were buried with this woman as objects of special value is extremely important. It suggests that she came from a family who made their wealth through farming, and with the forging of new and improved iron tools at this time, we can conclude that agriculture began to make a comeback. People like those found at the tombs in Lefkandi, Nicoria, and Athens came from a small group of the wealthiest, most powerful members of society during the Dark Age, the elite. Members of the social elite merited their status through several factors, the most important being their conduct and their wealth. How certain families became members of the elite is a matter of speculation. Some might have been descendants of Mycenaean nobility who managed to hold on to their possessions after the societal collapse, while some might have built their wealth themselves and held their new status over their poorer neighbors who turned to them for material help. Regardless of how elite families came into their wealth, the idealized values they were to hold and conduct themselves in formed the basis for Greece's emerging political systems. These values are best represented in the epic poetry of Homer in the Iliad and the Odyssey. Around the same time when they learned how to forge iron, the Greeks also relearned how to write. They adopted the Phoenician alphabet to represent the sounds of their own language, and this adaptation eventually evolved into the Greek alphabet as we know it today. With a new writing system, tales that were passed down through oral tradition could now be recorded, and the most famous of these stories by far are Homer's epics. The characters in Homeric poetry are members of the social elite, like Achilles, who is described in the Iliad as the best of the Greeks in both word and deed. One of Achilles' greatest concerns was whether he lived up to the code of excellence or virtue in his actions and speech, and he feared the shame he would bring upon himself if he failed to live up to that code. The elites were constantly in competition with each other, and excellence or virtue as a competitive value brought with it a grave sense of moral obligation. The most prominent example of this obligation is a concept called guest friendship, or xenia in Greek, which was to be respected no matter the situation. Xenia at its core was simply being hospitable towards foreigners and strangers who were visiting your city-state, but if you were to host one of these visitors in your home, you were institutionally bound to honor your new friendship with this person. This friendship could become a hereditary obligation. This value is exemplified in the Iliad through the Greek character Diomedes, who refuses to fight the Trojan warrior Glaucus when he discovers that Glaucus's grandfather had hosted his own grandfather while he was traveling years prior. The demand for excellence was not simply a code for men to follow, though. Elite women were bound to it as well. Keeping with Homeric poetry, in the Odyssey, Odysseus' wife Penelope is an example of what female excellence looks like. During Odysseus' absence, Penelope remained faithful to her husband and protected his property from his rivals. When Odysseus finally returns to his home on Ithaca after being away for 20 years fighting the Trojan War, he disguises himself as a beggar to test the hospitality of his household. The female head of the servants is rude to him, but Penelope treats him kindly and with the dignity owed to any visitor, after which Odysseus reveals his identity and kills the rivals plaguing his household along with the servants who mistreated him. Though Greek society was male-dominated, men and women were equal in that their adherence or lack of adherence to the code of excellence would have a tremendous impact on their reputations. Excellence in competition was visible not only in literature, but in the Olympic Games, a religious festival dedicated to Zeus, the king of the gods. Beginning in 776 BC, men who were wealthy enough to devote the time needed to train as professional athletes would come together every 4 years at Olympia to compete in athletic games with each other. These games focused on the spirit of competition, physical fitness, and the public recognition of winners. Originally, no prizes were awarded at the Olympic Games other than an olive wreath and bragging rights, but in later Greek athletic competitions, material prizes were awarded. Much like modern athletes, if a competitor was famous enough, he can make money from appearance fees too. Unlike the modern Olympics, athletes were not representing their home countries or cities. They were representing themselves to set themselves apart from ordinary people. The poet Pindar wrote of a family of Olympic victors, "It is impossible to conceal one's inborn nature. As for you, sons of Aletes, often the seasons have sent you victorious splendor for your consummate excellence when you won in sacred contests." For the Greeks, all communal activities, whether it be sport, sacrifices, or even war, were rooted in their religion. The conceptual basis for Greek religion was transmitted through myth. During the Dark Age, the Greeks encountered traders and merchants from the Near East who would tell their own mythological stories, which were artistically depicted on trade goods like furniture, pots, and pieces of jewelry. When the Greeks learned how to write again, they began recording their own versions of these myths. The poetry of Hesiod in his work Theogony had its origin in Near Eastern myth, especially the Mesopotamian epic of creation. Drawing heavily from Mesopotamian myth, Hesiod recorded how the gods came to be, and how even for them, existence was expected to be filled with violence, struggle, and various other forms of suffering. There was nevertheless a great concern for justice in the divine order. Hesiod believed that Zeus was the divine source of justice in all human affairs, which during the Dark Age would have been administered within families by the male head of the household, and on a larger scale by clan chiefs. Chiefs were initially granted some level of authority by their neighbors, who were roughly equal in their status and wealth when the need for a powerful leader arose. Chiefs had the authority to settle disputes within their own communities over property or duties, set punishments and rewards as a form of justice, oversee religious rituals, and organize defense against outside bands that might attack their own. With that said, chiefs in theory only had limited power over their bands. When a decision was to be made that would affect the whole community, the chief would not force his will upon the entire group, but had to persuade the other men to go along with his decision. Of course, persuasion gradually began to look like compulsion, and as the chief's wealth and status began to surpass that of their followers, class friction became more common. Another episode in Homer's Iliad embodies the friction between leaders and followers felt during this time. When King Agamemnon decides that he wants to extend the Trojan War, which had already been going on for 10 years, a soldier named Thersites speaks up in opposition, calling Agamemnon greedy and selfish in front of the entire assembly. Odysseus then speaks up in defense of Agamemnon and beats Thersites down. In this interaction, Agamemnon and Odysseus are representative of chiefs, while Thersites is representative of a follower who recognizes his right to voice his opinion in the assembly before a communal decision is made. In this fictional episode, Thersites' fellow soldiers approve of Odysseus beating him into submission, but this attitude could not have been further from the truth in reality. In the 8th century BC, the relationship between chiefs and peasants became so tense that the old system could not continue any longer, and the Greeks welcomed a new system of political organization, the city-state.